brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue.
And word to your mother, we are back here in the APUS History Underground compound with our song of the day, taking you back to Mr. Eschbacher's middle school acne-filled years with a little bit of Vanilla Ice. Stop. Alexa, stop. Because today we're going to talk about ice isolation. Yes, we're talking about the interwar years, 1920 to 1941. Guys, the evil people who make the AP test, they love that whole idea of continuity and change over time. Good old CCOT. So when we talk about a specific time period like this, 1920 to 1941, we always need to say to ourselves, self, what changed? What stayed the same? So, I've got a bunch of assignments up on the big board, but before we talk about this, a couple things. Many of you have been turning in your multiple choice scores. That's awesome. I love what I'm seeing. Remember, this is a confidential thing. I will not share them with anybody. But also, you are getting credit just for doing the work. So please make sure you don't have to impress me. Hey, Mr. Ash, I had a good day, I had a bad day. I just need as much feedback as I can so that I can teach you better. The other thing is, I will send some more stuff out to you, but I'm thinking about having AP review classes for the test, following that schedule, and actually doing Zoom, which is an app I learned about. I've learned more technology in the last couple days than I have in the last 20-something years. But it would actually allow us like a super FaceTime kind of thing, and we could all do AP review together. More on that coming later on. So, you got a bunch of documents, you got a bunch of stuff. When you are doing this lesson, you have some primary sources. You've got FDR's quarantine speech. You've got his Four Freedoms speech. I put some political cartoons up there for you. Basically, when I teach this lesson, usually in class, I teach a really dorky story about getting in a swimming pool. You guys know what I'm talking about. That pool looks nice, you know it's cold. There's two ways you can go in. You can do the common thing, especially seems like all the girls do it, you know, the little toe swish, the little dip of the ankle, you jump back out, you try to like ease and shimmy in. Or you can do it, I do, get about 20 feet back, get a running start, and just cannonball that sucker. A lot of kids think that we cannonballed into World War II. They think that, you know, on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, oh my gosh, we were attacked. Quick story. My wife's grandfather, Mike, he was a cool dude. I love talking to him. Mike was a straight up real G.I. Joe American hero. Guy had a Purple Heart and all these other medals. And I remember talking to him one time, and he said, you know, Mike had an 8th grade education. He dropped out of school during the Great Depression to work at a brick factory to help his family out. He also got drafted when he was 18 in 1940. Now wait a minute, why does that sound weird? When did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? That's right, December 7th, 1941. Mike was drafted in 1940. See, in 1940, Congress passed and FDR signed the Selective Service Act, which is a nice way of saying a draft. So yes, we had a peacetime draft. So we weren't just cannonballing in, you know, Pearl Harbor happened and oh my gosh, here we go. What we are going to see is a very gradual evolution in American foreign policy. But before we can get to that, we have to go back in time. Diddly, diddly, diddly. Maybe my producer, cameraman John, will give me a Wayne's World special effects soon. In 1920, the United States rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. Senate, remember, you've got to know this for even the regents. We have a system of checks and balances in our country. The president is chief diplomat. He can sign and negotiate treaties. However, the Senate must either ratify or reject said treaties. And unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson's baby, the Treaty of Versailles, it went down in flames. Why? Well, for one thing, we mentioned earlier this year that there were people in Congress, in the Senate, who had concerns about specific clauses in the treaty. We called them the reservationists. Guys like Henry Cabot Lodge, who said, look, I can work with you, but I've got concerns. You've also got some people who are hardliners who say, no way, there's no way I'm going to support this treaty, or the irreconcilables. Their big objection to the Treaty of Versailles was our membership in the League of Nations, particularly one little clause in the League of Nations Charter to operate. Article 10. Article 10 said that if any member of the League were attacked, all the members would have to join it. So this is where many Americans said, whoa, hang on, we just fought this war, now all of a sudden you want us to be forced into future wars just because. Now, in 1921, the U.S. did negotiate and sign a separate peace treaty with Germany. The war was over on our end, but we never joined the League of Nations. And perfect, my props have come here. So basically, the United States said, yeah, we're going to stay way over here. You guys in Europe, that's your problem way over there. Because the one geographic advantage our country's been blessed with, and we've been able to take advantage of that until, well, recently, was the fact that there's a whole lot of ocean between us and Europe. There's a whole lot of ocean between us and Asia. So, we sign a separate treaty, and America goes back to what Warren Harding called a return to normalcy, part of which was this idea of isolation. In 1921 and 22, a group of nations got together and signed documents, signed treaties at what was called the Washington Naval Conference. They signed tons of treaties. There was the 5-power treaty, the 9-power treaty, the 14-power treaty. Basically, what the Washington Naval Conference did was try to set limits on battleships. They created ratios. For every 5 battleships the U.S. and Great Britain had, other nations would get 3, or 1.67. The idea was disarmament, chill things out, reduce the risk of future wars. The problem was the agreement itself had loopholes in it. It did not restrict the number of small ships you could have. Plus, the Japanese got a very valuable concession from the United States and Great Britain. Both the U.S. and Great Britain made a promise to stop fortifying, building up defenses in the Far East. For us, that would be stop building up defenses in the Philippines. So the Japanese kind of walked out of there with 1, no battleships, fine, we'll build other stuff up. But 2, we basically said, we will stop building up defense and protection. Keep that in mind. In 1924, we see something called the Dawes Plan. Please do not get this confused with the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Severalty Act was a Native American assimilation program. The Dawes Plan was our attempt to force our allies to pay us back their World War I debts. If you remember, Germany was faced with untold, massive war reparations they could not pay off. They owed that money to allies like Britain and France, who owed us over $2 billion that we insisted they pay. So, in this Dawes Plan, which was created by an American banker, we loaned money to Germany, who kept a teeny tiny bit of it, basically for the rest of it, handed over to our allies, who kept a teeny tiny bit of it, but basically handed over the rest of it back to us. And because those European nations could not escape their debt, remember that global studies word, interdependence, that's why World War I will become one of the causes of the Great Depression. Now, fast forward in the 1920s. In 1928, under President Coolidge, Congress signs, or the President signs and Congress approves what's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, I like to say, was the kumbaya moment. Kumbaya, there'll be no more war. It essentially outlawed war as a foreign policy tool. But how in the world do you enforce that? What's the League of Nations going to do? Wag their finger at a country? Remember, who's not in it? That's right, us. So it's not really worth the paper that it's on. And again, it creates this false sense of isolation and, hey, we're not going to have war. And then from there, I'd like to explain how Japan and how the other Axis powers become more aggressive. You guys know I've got the little guy running around, James here. Little kids are cute, and sometimes they're cute in an evil way. Sometimes I'll catch James. I'll say, hey, you stop doing that. And he'll look at me, and then he'll have to try to figure out, am I serious about it? And I watch him look at me with a little smile as he takes a step towards something he's not supposed to touch. And then he creeps another step. And then I go, whoa, get over here. And here's what effectively happens. In 1931, the Japanese decide, let's test things out and see. They launch their invasion of Manchuria. It is brutal. They massacre civilians. They invade China. The League of Nations wags their finger at Japan. And Japan says, that's all you got? One, you got nothing. Two, we're leaving the League of Nations. What are you going to do about it? Oh, that's right, nothing. They were testing the resolve of the rest of the world. Remember that idea. All right, in 1933, we get a new president, Franklin Roosevelt. And FDR is going to change things up. He's going to do something, by the way, that's going to make Teddy, his cousin, kind of roll over in his grave. FDR, in a way, essentially tries to undo the big stick policy or the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He announces what we call, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Sorry for the bad Mr. Rogers impression. The good neighbor policy. He says, look, countries in Latin America, from now on, we're not going to hit you with the big stick. We're not going to intervene. We'll use arbitration and mediation to settle disputes. Now think about why he might do that. It's 1933. We're in the midst of the Great Depression. The last thing we need in a depression is to irritate other countries and make foreign trade situations worse. But there's another reason. You have Axis aggression. You have totalitarian dictatorships. You have other nations that are becoming more of a threat to us. Wouldn't it be nice to know that the countries in your part of the world have your back, or at least don't hate your guts? So that good neighbor policy in many ways becomes a reversal of the big stick. I'll never forget one time, there was this bully back when I was in grade school, and man, he was mean. He was big. He was bigger. I was a little kid back then. Yes, I was, believe it or not. So what did I do? Couldn't fight him. My mom would get mad at me. I told you before, we didn't want to make Irish Kathy mad. So, I made a new best friend. The bigger bully in grade school. The one kid that bully would not mess with. In 1933, FDR does something that creates a little bit of controversy. He recognizes the Soviet Union, the USSR, as a nation. Prior to that, ever since the Russian Revolution, the US had said, no, communist government, you do not exist. Why would he do that? Well, for one thing, Great Depression, maybe we can trade a little bit. But more importantly, the kryptonite, the boogeyman for Nazi Germany was Stalin's Soviet Union. That's why, if you remember last year in Global or AP World, when Stalin and Hitler signed that non-aggression pact in 1939, that scared the heck out of the United States. Because just having the idea that Stalin was on our side was supposed to be a check against Nazi aggression. All right. 1934 to 1936. One of the powers that Congress has is they can hold hearings to investigate things. Senator Nye, for 3 years, has a committee investigating why we got involved in World War I. For those of you guys who love conspiracy theories, this is right up your alley. The Nye Committee calls witnesses, and they go on and on. They make a big public spectacle, and they produce their findings. They declare that Woodrow Wilson helped antagonize the situation to draw us into war intentionally. They declare that the United States got sucked into a war that was not in our interest because of a conspiracy of bankers and arms manufacturers. They really get our tinfoil hats and stuff like that all fired up, and Americans say, never again! We are not going to get involved in that stuff. Big public outcry. So what happens? In 1935, 36, and 37, Congress passes and FDR signs, albeit reluctantly, what we call the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts are so important they're going to be on your Regents even. The Neutrality Act said, look, if two nations go to war, you are not allowed to sell weapons to either nation. It doesn't matter who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's evil, or who started it. Two, if there are nations at war, Americans cannot give credit, cannot give loans to either nation, regardless of who started it. Because that was something, both of those things happened prior to World War I with us. Americans could not travel on ships owned by countries at war. Again, think about the Lusitania. We were trying to avoid some of the events that got us involved in that war. And now, if you're FDR in the 1930s, when Axis aggression builds up more, you're kind of handcuffed. Let's go back to the times James been kind of nutty. Again, little kids. And if you think back to when you were a little kid, you did this. Mom or dad said, don't do that, don't do that. And you, of course, had to touch it. Or at least see how close you could be before they, got up. Japan tests us again. There are Standard Oil, yes, Standard Oil, tankers operating in the Yangtze River in China, which was considered then international waters. The Panay was a United States naval vessel guarding the Standard Oil tankers. The Japanese bombed the Panay and the tankers. And then they waited to see what we'd do. And we did nothing. And the Japanese said, "Oh, we're sorry." And they walked out of there saying, "These guys don't want to fight. We can do whatever we want." Now, we are at a situation, we go from hardcore isolation into legalized neutrality, into we don't want to mess with things. And then, all of a sudden, events speed up. In 1938, we have the Anschluss, where Hitler says, there are German-speaking people in Austria. Therefore, it should be a part of Germany. And the Nazis annex Austria. We do nothing. So in the same year, Hitler takes control of the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. And this time, well, basically nothing happens. We have that Munich Pact, which hopefully you learned about last year. The British, the French, the United States, they meet with Hitler, and they basically say, "Okay, Adolf, oh shucky darns, that's it, now no more." And Hitler's like, "Oh yeah, sure, I won't take any more territory." But basically we have legalized the bully stealing your lunch money. Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, gave the famous quote, "We have achieved peace in our time." Now, fun fact for your synthesis, guys. One of the people who was one of the architects at Munich was United States Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, JFK's daddy. Which reminds me of a funny story. Kennedy was all over FDR. "Make me the ambassador to Great Britain. Come on, come on. I've been a big campaign donor. I've worked for you in the SEC. I've been in the government." FDR loved to pull pranks on people. He loved to give people a hard time and bust their chops. Kennedy meets in the Oval Office with FDR, and he gives his whole list of why he's qualified, and FDR sits there at his desk, listens, and says, "Joe, you make good points, but I can't give you that job." Kennedy's about to cry. But Mr. President, I gotta... Joe, just stop, listen. I get that. It's not about your qualifications. It's that you'll embarrass us. See, Joe, they had this ceremony where the new ambassador, it's almost like becoming a knight, and you wear these riding breeches, like these short pants. Joe, you're bow-legged. If you show up in those short pants, we'll be the laughing stock of the world. And Kennedy's flustered. "I am not bow-legged." So what does FDR say with a stone-cold face? "Okay, Joe. Prove it. Drop your pants." Now, hypothetically speaking, of course, he will not be the last president to utter such words in the White House. Joe Kennedy drops his pants, standing there in his boxers, and there's FDR trying to, and finally just dies, literally falls onto his desk laughing. Maybe he shouldn't have let Kennedy there. Or, to be honest, maybe the time wasn't right in the minds of the American people. Regardless, you guys learned about appeasement last year. Appeasing a bully, appeasing an aggressor doesn't work. Back to the marker board. All right. So now, September 1st, 1939, Hitler and Stalin prior to this had signed the Non-Aggression Pact, and World War I starts. They both divvy up Poland, blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. And America's stunned. America's shocked. Especially with the fact that the Nazis and the Soviets are working together. Two boogeymans. The two bullies team up. So, now everything goes into hyperspeed mode. In 1939, Congress passes, FDR signs a new Neutrality Act. But there's a difference. I call this one the bad Chinese restaurant. takeout only, no delivery, and it's cash and carry. The new Neutrality Act says, look, we can provide aid to our allies, but cash only, no credit. Because again, low international debt and loans to our allies was one of the reasons why we had an interest in getting involved in World War I. And two, takeout only. You pick it up. We're not going to send American ships over there. There are other provisions, but the cash and carry is the big one. Can you see now the change? We've gone from isolation hardcore to neutrality to quasi-neutrality. That's going to lead to backlash in the United States. A new organization called America First gets created. They are isolationists. They basically are people who say, we do not need to get involved in European wars. They're like, look, we're over here. They're over there. The ocean's big enough. We'll be okay. Their most famous member was Charles Lindbergh. Do you remember Lindbergh? He was America's biggest hero in the 1920s. The guy who flew across the Atlantic Ocean. Charles Lindbergh is the ultimate example of going from hero to zero. He was the most popular American in the 20s. Flying across the Atlantic was the 1920s version of landing on the moon. By the time World War II comes, Lucky Lindy as he was called, he goes from hero to zero. Not only is he a member of America First, he travels to Nazi Germany. And when he comes back, it's like he's brainwashed. You know, hey, Hitler's got it going on. The Nazis are doing good things. And Lindbergh becomes this big, outspoken critic of the United States. And there are a group of people who are hardcore against getting involved. Go back to the New Deal. Do you remember Father Charles Coughlin? Coughlin was famous for his anti-Semitic views. Coughlin speaks out against getting involved. Let me show you a couple quick cartoons here as cameraman John tries to zoom in. Alright, our first one. The caption reads, Cooking with Goebbels Gas. If you remember from World War II, from AP World last year, who Joseph Goebbels was, one of the Nazi leaders, one of the leaders of the Holocaust. And if you look at the gas tanks, I think you can understand the symbolism. But the guy stirring the pot. Now we all know what that term, stirring the pot, means, causing trouble. If you look on the cartoon, the sleeve is labeled. It's Father Coughlin. Okay? The other cartoon that I want to share with you is, look at the lovely couple carrying their many, many, many babies who are all squawking. Take a look closely at it. The woman says, U.S. fascists. The husband is you-know-who, Hitler. And the children, the label says, Coughlinites. So FDR is getting attacks, getting critics from America First, from Father Coughlin, people accusing him of being a warmonger. But the tide is turning more and more and more now. Again, it's a change. Okay? In 1940, we're still technically neutral, but the United States works out a deal with Great Britain. The British agreed to give us certain British colonies where we can have some strategic naval bases in the Western Hemisphere to protect ourselves. In exchange, we provide the British with destroyers. In naval terms, destroyers are very important. Destroyers are the ships whose primary job is to hunt and kill submarines. And if you remember, the German submarines were operating during this time as what was called the Wolf Pack. Okay? 1941. One of the things that you're going to read for your assignment today. FDR gives what is called his Four Freedoms speech. If you go to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Monument in Washington, which you should sometime in your life, it's beautiful. Took my boys there a couple years back. They have his Four Freedoms speech where FDR says we need to make a world where everyone in the world is guaranteed four freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. FDR, in that same year, 1941, has a top secret meeting with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. They meet on a ship in international waters off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. All hush-hush. And there on that ship, they created a document, an agreement for their plans for after the war, called the Atlantic Charter. Good one to know. So now again, We might still technically be neutral, but we are really moving forward. In 1941, FDR also gets Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act. He says, we must make ourselves the arsenal of democracy. Think about it. We're America. What can we do better than anybody? We can make stuff. This now becomes, and look at the PowerPoint I gave you, we provide millions and millions, billions of dollars in aid to the Allies. Look at the chart that's on the PowerPoint, including the Soviet Union. Now, FDR's got to explain to the American people how we're neutral, but yet we're going to put all this money into helping to arm and resupply the Allies, even though we are not technically at war. So what's he do? He goes on the radio and gives us one of those. That's right, fireside chats. And again, FDR's fireside chats were always down home, folksy. Let me explain it to you in a simple way. So, he says, look, you don't want to get involved in your neighbor's business. But what happens if you look and your next door neighbor's house is on fire? You better do something, because that fire, if you do nothing, could spread and destroy your house. So he says to the American people, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you should lend him your garden hose. And that's all we're doing here. We're not in the war, guys. But, hey, the garden hose is military aid. By the way, what else is this Lend-Lease Act going to do? It's going to help get us out of what? The Great Depression. Because now we are producing. And now, once we officially enter World War II, we're going to produce more. And I've got some great stories. Next class, guys, we're going to talk about Twinkies, meatloaf. Oh my gosh, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff with production. And then, of course, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. A Sunday morning, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States had stationed most of its Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, except for our 4 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Boy, will that be important. And Pearl Harbor is the worst of a series of unfortunate events. We knew the attack was coming. We had already broken Japanese code, guys. Go back to when we talked about technology to break the Prohibition bootleggers' codes. We knew the Japanese were planning an attack, but we didn't have the information as to where. And it wasn't even so much difficult to break their code, but to get enough people who could translate Japanese fast. Shout out to your foreign language teachers if you want to make a lot of money. We thought the attack might be in Alaska. It could be in Wake Island, Midway, the Philippines. In fact, the last place they really thought was Pearl. Why? 1, it's very far away. How are you going to sneak up on us? 2, Pearl Harbor itself is very shallow. The primary way that the Japanese would attack us was they would use dive bombers, planes that would try to drop a bomb on a ship, and torpedo bombers. Planes that would fly, drop torpedoes, the torpedoes would sink into the water, and at a certain depth activate and go attack the ships. Pearl was so shallow, we said there's no way they can use torpedo bombers. What we didn't know was the Japanese had modified their torpedoes and basically put wooden boxes on them, almost like water parachutes, so that when they came down, they wouldn't go down so deep. We were more worried and distrustful of the people who were of Japanese ancestry living in Hawaii. We were afraid that they could be saboteurs. Remember that word we talked about before? Xenophobia. So the Navy actually took the step of clustering ships together. There was a section in Pearl Harbor called Battleship Row, with the idea if you get all the ships together, it'll be easier to guard them from sabotage. Guess what? It also makes it easier to hit them. The last awful thing. We saw the invasion coming. U.S. Army, there's no Air Force, and Navy radar operators saw this massive blob coming. A commander was called over, sir, what's this? And he said, oh, there's a squadron of Army B-17 bombers coming in today. They must be early. Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese commander, had 3 waves for his attack. The first wave was to take out the airfields. The second wave was to go after the ships. There was supposed to be a third wave to mop up the rest of the ships. Fortunately, sometimes you gotta wonder if somebody's looking out for us, Yamamoto called off the third wave. And as the Japanese fleet sailed away, Yamamoto was being congratulated, and he said, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. You can make a lot of synthesis connections with these pre-World War II moments all the way up through Pearl Harbor to today. For one thing, when President Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, 2017, he kept referencing this idea of America first, America first. And some people who've read their history called him out for that. That, hey, the last time you heard America first was the 1930s, and it, didn't look so good. Other things. Keep in mind that xenophobia against Japanese Americans, because next class we'll talk about World War II and what happens to Japanese Americans. And we will see parallels to that in people who are of Muslim faith or from Middle Eastern nations after 9/11. There's a famous poster that got created after Pearl Harbor Day. And it said on there, December 7th, 1941, never forget. And it showed a tattered American flag. Just like Fort Sumter, after the South attacked Fort Sumter to start the Civil War, that Fort Sumter flag did a tour around the country. And after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, go find the images of the tattered, destroyed flag that was hung at Ground Zero. 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor of my generation. When my grandparents were alive, I remember asking them, what do you know? Where were you when Pearl Harbor was attacked? My parents' generation, it was JFK. Where were you when you were assassinated? When he was assassinated? And again, there have only been 3 times where a massive attack has happened in the United States. The War of 1812, we were invaded by Britain. Pearl Harbor, where 3,000 Americans were killed in a sneak attack. And 9/11, where 3,000 Americans were killed in a sneak attack. Next class, we'll talk about battles. We've got a lot of stories to tell. We'll talk about the home front, because remember, I always like to say, war brings change. Guys, you did a wonderful job with the parking lot. Please, send me your questions, your concerns. I love this. I'm having a good old time. Until then, log off and plug in your chromies, homies. See you later.